Let us begin with colonial administration in Nigeria. This is a very important topic in government. It appears in your exams every single year. By the end of this lesson, you will understand the meaning of colonialism, the British system of indirect rule in Nigeria, the French system of assimilation, the Belgian system of association, the reasons for adopting indirect rule, the features of indirect rule, the impact of indirect rule, the problems of indirect rule, and how to answer exam questions. Take your notes. Let us go. First, what is colonialism? Colonialism is the policy of acquiring and maintaining colonies, especially for economic exploitation. A colonial power controls a territory and its people. The colonial power extracts resources. It imposes its laws and culture. It rules without the consent of the colonized people. Nigeria was a British colony from 1914 until independence in 1960. The British ruled Nigeria through a system called indirect rule. Other colonial powers used different systems. The French used assimilation. The Belgians used association. Now let me explain indirect rule. Indirect rule was the British system of colonial administration. It was developed by Lord Frederick Lugard. Lugard was the British High Commissioner for Northern Nigeria. He later became the Governor-General of Nigeria. Indirect rule meant that the British governed through traditional African rulers. The British did not replace African chiefs. They used them to carry out British policies. The chiefs collected taxes. They maintained law and order. They provided labour for British projects. In return, the chiefs received British support. They were given salaries. They were protected from their enemies. They gained more power than they had before. Indirect rule was first used in northern Nigeria. The north already had a centralized system of emirs. The British simply took control of the top. The emirs ruled under British supervision. British officials, called residents, advised the emirs. The residents reported to the British governor. The governor reported to the colonial office in London. Indirect rule was later extended to the western and eastern regions, but it was less successful in these areas. The Yoruba had a complex system of checks and balances. The British had to modify their approach. The Igbo had no chiefs. The British had to create warrant chiefs. These warrant chiefs had no traditional authority. The people did not respect them. This led to problems. Now let me explain the reasons for adopting indirect rule. The British adopted indirect rule for several reasons. The first reason was shortage of personnel. Britain did not have enough officials to govern Nigeria directly. Indirect rule allowed a few British officials to control a large territory. The second reason was lack of funds. Direct rule would have been expensive. The British would have had to build a large administration. Indirect rule was cheaper. The third reason was the existing centralized systems in the north. The emirates were already well organized. It was easier to use them than to replace them. The fourth reason was the language barrier. Few British officials spoke local languages. Using traditional rulers as intermediaries solved this problem. The fifth reason was to preserve traditional institutions. The British claimed they wanted to protect African culture. Indirect rule allowed traditional rulers to continue. The sixth reason was to prevent resistance. The British feared that removing traditional rulers would cause rebellions. Using them kept the people calm. The seventh reason was the success of indirect rule in India. Britain had used similar methods in India. They applied the same approach in Africa. Now let me explain the features of indirect rule. Indirect rule had several features. The first feature was the use of traditional rulers. The British recognized the emirs, obas, and chiefs as local authorities. The second feature was the preservation of traditional institutions. The British allowed traditional courts, tax systems, and law enforcement to continue. The third feature was the appointment of British residents. Each emirate had a British resident. The resident advised the emir. He also reported to the British governor. The fourth feature was the division of powers. The emir handled local affairs. The British handled external affairs, defense, and major policies. The fifth feature was the collection of taxes. The emirs collected taxes for the British. They kept a portion for themselves. The sixth feature was the use of native courts. Traditional courts handled local disputes. They applied customary law. They could not hear cases involving Europeans or capital offences. The seventh feature was the establishment of native treasuries. The emirs managed local budgets. They received grants from the British. Now let me explain the impact of indirect rule. Indirect rule had both positive and negative effects. The positive effects included the preservation of traditional institutions. The emirs and chiefs continued to rule. The system also reduced resistance. The people accepted British rule because their own leaders were still in place. It also provided a cheap and efficient administration. The British achieved their goals with few resources. The negative effects included the distortion of traditional systems. The British gave chiefs more power than they had before. In the north, the emirs became more authoritarian. Their power was no longer checked. In the east, the British created warrant chiefs who had no traditional authority. The people did not respect them. This led to the Aber Women's Riot of 1929. Indirect rule also deepened ethnic divisions. The British treated each group separately. This encouraged ethnic consciousness. It also hindered the development of nationalism. Traditional rulers cooperated with the British. They were not interested in independence. Now let me explain the problems of indirect rule. Indirect rule faced several problems. The first problem was the lack of centralized systems in the East. The Igbo had no chiefs. The British had to create warrant chiefs. These chiefs were corrupt. They abused their power. The people resisted. The second problem was the educated elite. Western educated Nigerians resented indirect rule. They wanted to participate in government. They saw traditional rulers as obstacles to progress. The third problem was the conflict between traditional rulers and the educated elite. The British favoured traditional rulers. The educated elite were excluded. This created tension. The fourth problem was the cost. Even though indirect rule was cheaper than direct rule, it still cost money. The British had to pay salaries to chiefs and residents. The fifth problem was communication. The British residents did not always understand local languages and customs. They made mistakes. The sixth problem was the slow pace of change. Traditional rulers resisted reforms. They wanted to maintain their power. This slowed development. Now, let me explain the French system of assimilation. Assimilation was the French colonial policy. The goal of assimilation was to turn Africans into French citizens. The French believed that their culture was superior. They wanted to spread French language, law, and customs. They did not use traditional rulers. They ruled directly. Africans who adopted French culture could become French citizens. They had the same rights as French people. They could vote. They could serve in the French Parliament. But very few Africans became French citizens. The requirements were too strict. Assimilation failed. The French then adopted a policy of association. Now let me explain the Belgian system of association. Association was the Belgian colonial policy. The Belgians ruled directly, like the French, but they did not try to turn Africans into Belgians. They recognized that African cultures were different. They tried to work with traditional institutions, but only at the local level. The Belgians were known for their harsh rule in the Congo. They exploited the people and resources ruthlessly. Their policy was called association because they associated with traditional rulers, not because they treated them as equals. The Belgian Congo gained independence in 1960 after a violent struggle. Now let me compare the British and French systems. The British used indirect rule through traditional rulers. The French used direct rule and assimilation. The British preserved traditional institutions. The French tried to replace them. The British ruled through chiefs. The French ruled through their own officials. The British policy was cheaper. The French policy was more expensive. The British allowed local cultures to continue. The French tried to impose their culture. The British system was more successful in the long run. The French system created more resistance. A common exam question asks you to define indirect rule and explain the reasons for its adoption. Here is a sample answer. Indirect rule was the British system of governing through traditional African rulers. The reasons for adopting indirect rule include shortage of British personnel, lack of funds, the existence of centralized systems in the north, language barriers, the desire to preserve traditional institutions, the need to prevent resistance, and the success of similar methods in India. These factors made indirect rule the most practical approach for Britain. Another exam question asks you to describe the features of indirect rule. Here is your answer. The features of indirect rule include the use of traditional rulers, preservation of traditional institutions, appointment of British residents, division of powers between British and traditional rulers, collection of taxes by chiefs, operation of native courts, and establishment of native treasuries. These features allowed Britain to control Nigeria with few resources. Another exam question asks you to discuss the problems of indirect rule. Here is your answer. The problems of indirect rule include the lack of centralized systems in the East, leading to the creation of warrant chiefs, conflict with the educated elite who wanted to participate in government, the cost of maintaining the system, communication problems between British residents and local rulers, and the slow pace of change. These problems led to resistance and protests, including the Aber Women's Riot of 1929. Another exam question asks you to compare the British and French colonial policies. Here is your answer. The British used indirect rule through traditional rulers. The French used direct rule and assimilation. The British preserved traditional institutions. The French tried to replace them. The British policy was cheaper. The French policy was more expensive. The British allowed local cultures to continue. The French tried to impose their culture. The British system was more successful in Nigeria. The French system created more resistance in their colonies. Here is what you need to take away. Indirect rule was the British system of governing through traditional rulers. It was adopted due to shortage of personnel, lack of funds, and existing centralized systems. Its features included traditional rulers, British residents, division of powers, and native courts. Problems included the lack of centralized systems in the East, conflict with the educated elite, cost, and slow change. The French used assimilation, trying to turn Africans into French citizens. The Belgians used association, ruling directly but working with traditional rulers at the local level. Understanding colonial administration is essential for understanding Nigeria's political development. Practice these concepts. When you have them down, move to topic 3.